You know the shape of the Aston Martin Lagonda, even if you've never heard the name. The long, low silver wedge that looked as though it had been folded from a single sheet of paper. When it arrived in 1976, it was the most expensive and most advanced saloon on Earth, built to take on Rolls-Royce and win. It wore the first fully digital dashboard ever fitted to a motorcar, hand-built by craftsmen for the richest men alive. Aston Martin had already survived recession, receivership, and a locked factory, the near death of the whole marque. It had clawed its way back from the grave to build this, and then the most futuristic car in the world became a global joke, a byword for a machine that simply would not work. How? How does the car that was built to be the future end up its punchline? That's what this is about. Chapter 1. The Locked Gates. The town of Newport Pagnell sits in Buckinghamshire, a market town on the old coaching road north, and for the better part of 2 centuries, it made things that moved. Carriages first, then motorcars. On Tickford Street, behind a modest, half-timbered frontage that looked more like a country inn than a factory, craftsmen had been shaping metal by hand since the 1820s, first for a coach builder named Salmons, later for Aston Martin, whose cars were assembled there one at a time by men who knew every curve of every panel by touch. One of those men was Jack Hilliam. He was a panel beater, a lead loader, one of the tradesmen whose hands turned flat sheets of aluminium into the flowing shapes of a motor car, using tools with names that belonged to an older world: flatters and chasers, flippers and tuckers, shrinker fitters. He worked to tolerances he could feel in his fingertips, and on the 30th of December 1974, when he came back from the Christmas break, he found the gates of the factory locked. It had been coming for a while, though nobody on the floor liked to say so. In 1972, the industrialist David Brown, whose initials had given the DB cars their name, had sold Aston Martin to a Birmingham consortium called Company Developments, run by a man named William Wilson. The DB prefix was quietly dropped. The DBS simply became the V8, and then the world turned against small makers of expensive cars. The recession came. The oil shock of 1973 sent petrol prices soaring and buyers running. California, the single richest market for a thirsty British sports car, brought in emissions rules that Aston could not meet, and the American door swung shut. By the end of 1974, the money was gone. The receiver was called in. Production stopped. It was the marketing manager, Fred Hartley, who broke the news to the workforce, not on the factory floor, but at the local cinema, the only room in town big enough to hold them all. A handful of cars had been built that entire year. The largest employer in Newport Pagnell, in a place where families had been making wheeled things for 5 generations, fell silent. Jack Hilliam did what a craftsman does when the tools are all he has left. He gathered his flatters and chasers and shrinker fitters and carried them out before the doors were sealed, because a panel beater without his tools is nothing, and he did not intend to be nothing. In the long months of the shutdown, he took a bus each morning to Rolls-Royce, where there was still work for a man who could beat aluminium, and he waited. By Peter Sprague's own telling, and we will come to Peter Sprague shortly, the death of Aston Martin was mourned in the unlikeliest of places. Sprague liked to say that the American newsman, Walter Cronkite, marked the passing of the marque on the CBS Evening News, in black tie, as though eulogizing a head of state. Whether it happened quite as he remembered it or not, the story tells you something true. That even in America, people understood that something was being lost, a name that meant something, a way of making things that could not simply be restarted once it stopped. The gates stayed locked through the winter and into the spring, and then a stranger arrived who had read about all this in a newspaper, an ocean away, and decided he could not let it end. Chapter 2. The Man Who Fell in Love with a Factory. Peter Sprague was American, and he was not, on paper, the obvious saviour of a British car company. He was the chairman of National Semiconductor, one of the young giants of what was only just beginning to be called Silicon Valley, a man the financial press would come to describe as the Valley's first venture capitalist. He understood silicon, capital and risk. He did not, particularly, understand cars, but he understood the smell of a workshop and the sight of skilled hands at work, and when he flew across the Atlantic and walked through the gates at Newport Pagnell, something happened to him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. He did not fall in love with the cars. He fell in love with the factory, with the craftsmanship, the dedication, the sheer intelligence of the people who worked there. He wanted to own that before he had any clear idea of what he would do with it. He did not do it alone. He brought in George Minden, a Toronto hotelier who ran the elegant Windsor Arms and sold Aston Martins on the side. A man so devoted to the marque that he had bought 6 brand-new V8s just weeks before the company collapsed, and now stood to lose everything unless someone kept it alive. And he brought in Alan Curtis, a British property developer and a keen aviator, a man comfortable with big decisions and expensive machines. Alongside them stood a retired Sheffield steel magnate, Quiet Money, from the north. 4 men, and between them, a plan. The plan was a masterpiece of nerve. In the spring of 1975, the receiver sold the business as a going concern for around £1.5 million. Sprague structured the purchase so cleverly that against a Bank of America loan secured on the finished cars sitting in the works, and £300,000 already resting in the receiver's account, he committed only about £170,000 of his own money. For that, he bought a legend. The shell was renamed Aston Martin Lagonda, 1975, limited, and the gates opened again. Jack Hilliam came back from Rolls-Royce. So did the others. The hooter sounded once more over Tickford Street. But a rescue is not a business. Sprague and his partners now owned a tiny company that built a handful of handmade sports cars a year, in a market that had just tried to kill it. They needed volume. They needed cash. They needed something bigger than a 2-door coupe for gentleman races, something that could take on Rolls-Royce and Bentley at the very top of the market, and, crucially, chase the vast new rivers of money then flowing out of the Middle East. Sprague and Minden, men who understood wealth, understood exactly where the next decade's money would be. It would be in Riyadh and Kuwait City and Doha, and it would want to be driven in something magnificent. There was a young stylist at Newport Pagnell who had been sketching just such a thing, and when Sprague saw the drawings, he did what men of his temperament do. He backed himself. He looked at what was on the paper, asked his chief engineer whether the team could actually build it, and decided, more or less on the spot, that they would. Years later, Sprague reached for a comparison to describe the audacity of it, a near-bankrupt company betting its survival on the most radical car in the world. It was, he said, comparable to building the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. He meant it as a point of pride. He did not yet know how much of that comparison would come true, the brilliance and the desperation and the terrible cost. Chapter 3. The Man with the Ruler. The young stylist was named William Towns, and he had talked his way into the job. He had arrived at Aston Martin in 1966 to design seats, a modest brief for a man who wanted to shape whole cars, and then quietly manoeuvred himself into styling the DBS, the car that would carry the company through the end of the 60s. Towns drew the way an architect thinks, in straight lines and flat planes, in the confident geometry of the future as the future was imagined in the age of Concorde. He had little patience for curves that existed only to be pretty. When Sprague and Curtis asked for a 4-door saloon to conquer the world, Towns went home and drew something that had never existed. He worked in bursts of 12-hour days, and in roughly a month he produced a shape so severe, so uncompromising, that it seemed to have been folded rather than sculpted. A long, low wedge of a motor car, all razor edges and flat surfaces, its nose dropping almost to the road. People called it the folded paper style, and the name stuck, because that is exactly what it looked like. A sheet of paper creased once, sharply, by a very steady hand. Towns was unsentimental about why. The shape, he explained, was decided by aerodynamics more than anything else. Lift a car's nose, and you get terrible problems at speed. Keep it low and flat, and the air works with you, rather than against you. He was not chasing beauty, he was chasing physics, and beauty followed him home. Sprague never forgot the moment the drawing was unveiled. Here was a spectacularly radical 4-door design, and the decision to build it, he said, was made in a single day. There was no dissension. All 4 directors looked at the paper and felt the same thing, that they simply wanted to own the car in William Towns's drawings. It is one of the purest moments in the whole story. 4 men, a fragile company, and a picture so compelling that caution never got a word in. And then came the second decision, the one that would matter more than the shape, more than the engine, more than the price. The one that turns this from a story about a beautiful car into a story about a beautiful car that nearly took a company down with it. If the outside of the Lagonda was to be the future, then the inside could not be the past. And so someone asked the question, why should a car from the future have the same dials, the same switches, the same wood-rimmed instruments that every other car had carried for 50 years? Sprague, after all, did not come from the world of cars. He came from the world of silicon. His whole fortune was built on the idea that electronics could do what mechanical things had always done, only better, smaller, cleaner. The chief engineer, Mike Loseby, had been to National Semiconductor's headquarters in Santa Clara, California, and there, in that temple of the microchip, he had been captivated by something almost absurdly ordinary. The buttons in the lifts. They were touch-sensitive. You did not press them, you simply touched them, and they knew. Loseby came back thinking about a dashboard with no switches at all. A dashboard where you laid a fingertip on a smooth panel, and the car obeyed. So the decision was taken. The Lagonda would have the first fully digital, computer-managed dashboard ever fitted to a production car. The dials would be gone, replaced by glowing electronic readouts. The switches would be gone, replaced by around 40 touch-sensitive panels that would sense the faint electrical resistance of a human finger. It was breathtaking. It was, quite literally, years ahead of anything else on any road on Earth. There was only one difficulty, and at the time, it did not feel like a difficulty at all. It felt like a challenge, and these were men who loved a challenge. The technology to make such a thing work reliably, in a moving car, in the heat and cold and vibration of the real world, did not yet exist. Nobody had built it because nobody yet could. Aston Martin had just promised to. Chapter 4. The Coach Builders of Tickford Street. To understand what the Lagonda was, you have to walk the floor at Newport Pagnell, because this was not a car that came out of a stamping press. It was a car that came out of human hands, in a building where the 20th century's mass production had never quite been allowed in. A visitor arriving at the works would notice the quiet first. Not silence. There was always the tap of hammers, the hiss of paint, the murmur of men working close together, but the absence of the great mechanical roar of a proper car plant. Here a single car took shape slowly, passing from one set of hands to the next, and each set of hands belonged to a man who had spent a working lifetime learning one thing and learning it completely. In the body shop, the aluminium arrived as flat sheet and left as sculpture. Jack Hilliam and men like him worked it over wooden and steel formers, called bucks, coaxing the flat metal into the Lagonda's long flanks with wooden mallets and steel hammers, listening to the note the metal made because the sound told them when it was right. A panel that looked machine perfect had in fact been beaten and planished and stroked into shape by someone who could feel a high spot the size of a grain of rice through the pad of his thumb. When two panels met, the join was filled not with plastic, but with molten lead, wiped smooth with a wooden paddle, and a cloth soaked in tallow, the ancient art of lead loading, dying everywhere else in Britain, alive on Tickford Street. The air changed as you moved through the building. In the body shop it smelled of metal and tallow and the faint sweetness of the gas torches. In the paint shop it was sharp with solvent, coat after coat, laid on and rubbed back by hand until the surface had a depth you could sink into. And then you reached the trim shop, and the smell became something else entirely. The deep, animal richness of Connolly leather, and beneath it, the warm sawdust scent of walnut. This was where the Lagonda became a Rolls-Royce rival rather than merely a rakish saloon. The seats were cut and stitched from whole hides. The dashboard fascia, around whatever electronic madness was destined to live behind it, was veneered in burr walnut, book-matched so the grain flowed in mirror image across the cabin. Underfoot went Wilton wool carpet, the same weave that dressed the floors of stately homes. A trimmer would spend the better part of a week on a single interior, and think nothing of it, because the man in Kuwait or Mayfair who paid for it would run his hand along that stitching and know, instantly, whether it had been done properly. At the heart of it all sat the engine, and the engine was a genuine masterpiece, a 5.3-litre V8, twin overhead camshafts on each bank, the whole block and heads cast in aluminium alloy, breathing through 4 enormous Weber carburetors. It made around 280 horsepower, and it was assembled and signed by one man, whose name went on a plaque bolted to the cam cover. Aston Martin did not build engines by committee. Each one had an author. The target, when the Lagonda finally reached production, was roughly 1 car a week. 1. In a world where Ford could turn out 1,000 cars before the Newport Pagnell trimmers had finished a single set of seats, Aston Martin was betting its future on doing the opposite of everything the modern motor industry believed. Slower, rarer, costlier, made by hand, on a site where they had been making things by hand since before the railways came. It was magnificent. It was also, in a way nobody on that floor could yet see, the perfect setting for a tragedy, because all this patient, unhurried, analog craft was about to be married to the most impatient, unforgiving, and untested electronics the industry had ever attempted. Chapter 5. A Car from the Future. When the Lagonda was finished, truly finished, as a thing you could sit in and be driven in, it did not look like any other car in the world, and that was the entire point. It was enormous, and yet it sat almost as low to the ground as a Porsche 911. It was longer and wider than a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, and yet where the Rolls announced itself with height and chrome and the confidence of tradition, the Lagonda simply lay there, flat and sharp and impossibly modern, like something that had landed rather than been driven up. The headlights hid beneath the bonnet and rose only when needed. Inside, the driver faced a single-spoke steering wheel, one thin arm of metal connecting rim to hub, because 2 or 3 spokes would have interrupted the view of that extraordinary electronic dashboard, and it was expensive in a way that was meant to make people gasp. Towns's original ambition had been a car costing around £20,000. By the time customers were actually taking delivery, the figure had climbed to nearly £50,000, some £18,000 more than a Silver Shadow, more than a Ferrari 400, more than a Maserati Chialami. This was, quite deliberately, one of the most expensive motor cars on earth. Aston Martin was not apologising for the price. The price was the pitch, because the customer Aston Martin had in mind was not principally the English gentleman. He was the man Sprague and Minden had seen coming, the man in the Gulf, sitting atop the greatest transfer of wealth in modern history, looking for something that money could buy which other men's money could not. A Rolls-Royce was magnificent, but a Rolls-Royce was also what everyone bought. The Lagonda was rarer, stranger, more daring. It was the future, and it could be parked outside a palace in Riyadh where it would be the only one for 1,000 miles. Aston Martin understood this market well enough to court it directly. The company printed a brochure in Arabic. Cars went to Saudi Arabia, to Oman, to Kuwait, to Qatar. A limousine version was offered, stretched and fitted with televisions front and rear, for buyers whose journeys came with an entourage. The Wedge from Buckinghamshire became, improbably, a symbol of oil money splendour, a folded paper spaceship gliding through cities that had themselves risen out of the desert in a single generation. Back home, the reception was different in tone, but no less admiring. The motoring press could hardly believe what Aston Martin had dared. Here was a company that 18 months earlier had been a locked factory and a black-tie obituary, now unveiling the most technologically ambitious luxury car in the world. There was something almost defiant about it. A very British 2 fingers raised at decline itself. We are not finished. We can still build the future. Look. And for one shining moment, in one great hall in West London, everyone looked. Chapter 6. The Star of the Show. It was the 16th of October, 1976, at the London Motor Show, in the vast halls at Earl's Court, as it happened, the last motor show that grand old venue would ever host. And on the Aston Martin stand stood the Lagonda, low and silver and astonishing, drawing a crowd that would not disperse. The response was rapturous, and it came from people who did not hand out praise lightly. Motorsport magazine called it the star of the show, practical futurism, it said, with sophisticated style and splendid luxury. The Prime Minister, James Callaghan, came and folded himself into the driver's seat. Colin Chapman, the mercurial genius behind Lotus, was so struck by that impossible glowing dashboard that he marched one of his own engineers, Mike Kimberley, across to the stand and demanded to know why on earth Lotus couldn't produce instrumentation like that. By the end of the show, Aston Martin had taken 76 deposits, 76 buyers willing to put real money down, most of them for a car that did not yet properly exist, on the strength of a shape and a promise. For a company that measured its output in single cars per week, 76 was not a number. It was a lifeline. It was proof that Sprague's gamble, The Spitfire, built in the middle of the battle, might actually fly. This was the summit. Everything the four directors had bet on, everything Towns had drawn and Lowsby had dreamed and Hilliam's hands had shaped, had arrived at this one bright afternoon in a hall full of admiring faces. A dying company had reached up and touched the future, and the world had applauded. But the future, as it turned out, was not quite there, because the Lagonda on that stand was, in the most important respect, a beautiful fiction. Its spectacular dashboard did not work. It could not have worked. The electronics to make it work did not yet exist, and everyone on the technical side quietly knew it. The car showed its glowing displays courtesy of a separate, roofless mock-up standing nearby, an electronic buck whose screens merely looked alive. The show car itself could not run under its own power. And when the BBC's cameras captured the magnificent new Lagonda apparently gliding forward under its own steam, what the nation was in fact watching was a 2-ton motorcar rolling gently downhill, pushed by gravity, because the thing under the bonnet and behind the fascia was not yet ready to move it an inch. Nobody in that hall could see the cliff. The deposits were real. The praise was real. The pride was real. But the promise Aston Martin had made that it could deliver a car from the future, on time, to customers who had paid for it, rested entirely on a technology that had been ordered before it had been invented. The applause at Earl's Court would echo for a long time. So would the silence when the applause was over, and the cars did not come, and the smoke began to curl from the dashboard. But that comes later. Chapter 7. The Relay of Failure. The trouble with promising the future is that someone eventually has to build it, and through the whole of 1977 and into 1978, a small group of men at Newport Pagnell discovered, one hard week at a time, that the dashboard they had promised the world could not yet be made to work. The problem was elegant in the way that all disasters are elegant when you look back at them. Aston Martin had designed a car around a control system that did not exist, on the assumption that if you needed a thing badly enough, and paid cleverly enough, someone would invent it for you. The dials were meant to be glowing electronic readouts. The switches were meant to be those touch-sensitive panels that read the resistance of a fingertip. None of it was theoretical. The physics was sound. But to make it survive inside a car, through heat and cold and vibration and the slow corrosion of the years in 1977, was to ask for something the whole of the electronics industry had not yet delivered. The first firm handed the job was Fotherby Willis Electronics, over in West Yorkshire. They set to work on the instruments, and before they could finish, financial troubles of their own forced them out, and the great unsolved problem was passed along like a parcel nobody could open. It was Alan Curtis who chose where it went next. He sent it to the Cranfield Institute of Technology, specifically its Centre for Aeronautics, a serious place, full of clever people at the very frontier of what electronics could do. On paper, it looked like the right decision. In practice, it was the beginning of the end, and Mike Lowsby, the chief engineer, said so afterwards in words that have never quite lost their sting. "You should never," he said, "put an academic on a job like this, because they will never finish it and never make it work." Cranfield, he concluded, made a fearful mess of the electronics, not through stupidity, but because for all their brilliance at the frontier, they had no feel for the brutal, grubby realities of what would and would not work inside a moving motorcar. And the thing they built was, by any measure, a monster. The control system reportedly weighed around 180 pounds, the weight of a grown man, buried in a luxury saloon. It ran on a cable loom of 300 pairs of wires, snaking back to computer boxes tucked beneath the rear seat. At its heart sat National Semiconductor's own IMP16, a 16-bit microprocessor card of the kind that belonged, in that era, in laboratories and industrial controllers, each one costing around $1,400, and each one, in this application, prone to losing its mind. Because that is what it did. It glitched. It stumbled. The displays that were meant to glow with the confidence of the space age flickered and went dark. And at one press demonstration in the spring of 1978, in front of the very people whose job it was to tell the world how magnificent this car was, the dashboard began to smoke, thin curls of it, rising from behind that beautiful book-matched walnut as the assembled journalists watched. The story of the smoking dashboard has been told so many times by so many people that it has passed into folklore. No single reporter's name is reliably attached to it, but it hardly matters whether it happened exactly once or in some softened, half-remembered form, because it captures the truth of that year with terrible precision. Aston Martin had sold the world a car from the future, and the future, when it finally arrived at Newport Pagnell, arrived on fire. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Now the numbers began to turn against them, and the numbers were merciless. The delay alone was catastrophic. The Lagonda had been unveiled to acclaim in October 1976. But the electronics pushed the first real deliveries back by something like 2.5 years, an eternity for a company surviving on deposits and prestige. Cars that had been paid for did not come. Haggerty, the classic car specialists, would later record the human scale of it in a single devastating line. Only 16 cars built in the first 2 years of production. 16. For a company that had staked its survival on this one model, 16 cars was not slow. It was a slow death. And then there was the money the electronics ate. Here the story splits, and it is worth being honest about where. The figure that has echoed down the decades, repeated everywhere, is that the development of the electronics alone came to 4 times the entire budget for the rest of the car. It is quoted so often that it has become the headline fact of the whole tragedy. But it comes to us secondhand, through the mark histories, and no one has ever pinned it precisely to a page. There is a harder, more concrete figure attributed to a report in the New York Times. The directors, it said, believed the Lagonda's development could be done for $850,000 in a single year. It ended up costing $3.5 million and taking 3. Look at those two numbers together, 850,000 becoming $3.5 million, and you find your 4-fold overrun sitting right there in the total cost of the entire program. It may well be that the famous line about the electronics costing 4 times the car is simply the memory of that, a whole project that ran to 4 times its budget, worn smooth by retelling until it became a story about the dashboard alone. Either way, the meaning is the same. A near-bankrupt company had bet its survival on a technology it could not afford, and the technology took everything it had and asked for more. You could see what it did to the men who had to live with it. The manufacturing director, David Flint, spent 2 days and 2 nights before one delivery trying to make the Cranfield harness behave, fitting and refitting a system that fought him at every turn, and at last he reached the end of himself. If they wanted to push this car out of the door in that state, he told them, they could do it themselves. He was going home, and he went. It is one of the truest moments in the whole story. Not a villain, not a fool, but a good engineer worn down to nothing by a machine that would not work, walking out into the night because there was simply no more of him to give. It was Steve Coughlin, the engineering director, who finally reached across an ocean for help. He found a small firm in Texas called the Javelina Corporation, whose speciality was aircraft instruments, people who understood electronics that had to survive in the punishing environment of a cockpit. Its president was a man named Brian Refoy, and Refoy took one look at what had come out of Cranfield and did not mince his words. The system, he said, was pretty much a nightmare. And then he did the thing Aston Martin had been waiting 2.5 years for someone to do. He made it work. Not perfectly, not forever, but Refoy and his team had a car running in something like 45 days. What a university's centre for aeronautics had turned into a £180 monster, a small Texas avionics firm quietly tamed in 6 weeks. Javelina developed the production electronics and would, in time, develop the cathode ray tube system that came after. The knowledge had been out there all along. It had simply been in Dallas rather than Bedfordshire, and it had cost Aston Martin 2.5 years and a fortune to find it. But by the time Refoy had the car running, the damage to the Lagonda's name had already been done, and it had been done, of all places, in front of an aristocrat, at a stately home, before the world's press. Chapter 9. The Push at Woburn Abbey. The first customer was Lady Tavistock. The place was Woburn Abbey, her family's great house. The date was April 1978, and what happened there would follow the Lagonda for the rest of its life. The car was not ready. Everyone knew the car was not ready. The staff at Newport Pagnell had worked on it without stopping for 2 days, trying to coax the Cranfield electronics into behaving for just one afternoon, just long enough to hand the keys to the great lady and let the photographers do their work. It was not enough. Before the handover could take place, the Lagonda broke down. This magnificent machine, this car from the future, this £50,000 rival to Rolls-Royce, it would not run. And so, in front of the assembled press, it had to be pushed. By hand, 2 tons of folded paper spaceship shoved across the gravel of Woburn Abbey by men in their shirt sleeves to meet the woman who had paid for it. And when the ceremony was done, it was pushed away again because it could not leave under its own power any more than it had arrived under it. Peter Sprague did not hide. That was not his way. He stood before the press and he held up the failed circuit board, the small piece of the future that had let them all down. And he said the only honest thing there was to say. "We goofed," he told them. I goofed. It was a big man's response to a small disaster, and it did him credit. But it did not save the car, because the image that went out into the world was not of Sprague's honesty. It was of the pushing, a car sold as the most advanced saloon on earth, being manhandled across a stately lawn because its computer had died. That picture said everything, and it said it in a language everyone understood. The verdict, when it finally hardened, was brutal. Years later, the Pulitzer-winning critic Dan Neal placed the Lagonda in Time magazine's roll call of the 50 worst cars ever made, and reached for a word that captured the scale of the collapse. He called it Aston Martin's Dunkirk, a catastrophe. A car built around cutting-edge electronics and cathode ray displays that would have been tremendously impressive, he wrote, if only any of them had ever worked. It is worth remembering that this reputation hardened slowly, and partly in hindsight. The British press of the day was not so cruel. When Motorsport tested a working car in 1982, it was genuinely admiring, noting gently that you had to wait perhaps half a minute for the displays to warm up and settle, but admiring nonetheless. The disaster we remember was built up over years, out of owner experience and retelling and the slow accretion of anecdote, until the Lagonda became a punchline. Top Gear would eventually put it best, and most damningly, the electronics, they said, were less unreliable than simply absent. But absent or not, the car had to be sold, and the company had to survive. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes this a story of endurance and not merely of failure, is that somehow, against all of it, Aston Martin did. Chapter 10. The Long Retreat. Here is the paradox at the very centre of this story, the thing that makes it stranger and sadder than a simple tale of a bad car. The Lagonda was very nearly the death of Aston Martin, and the Lagonda also helped keep Aston Martin alive. It drained the company, the overrun, the delay, the humiliation, but it also brought money in. Those 76 deposits were real, the Gulf sales were real, the prestige of having built, however painfully, the most futuristic car in the world was real, and it kept the name flickering through years when a lesser name would have gone dark for good. The Lagonda took with one hand and gave with the other, and Aston Martin lurched forward on the difference. The dashboard, meanwhile, went on being fixed and refixed for the rest of the car's life, a decade-long argument between ambition and reality. The early cars had their red LED digital readouts and touch panels. The troublesome single-spoke wheel controls and the plasma elements were dropped around 1980. Then, from October 1984, came the boldest step of all. The LEDs gave way to 3 cathode ray tubes, actual miniature television screens designed by Javelina and supplied by Clinton Electronics, a firm that had built such displays for the F-15 Eagle fighter program. A synthesized voice was added, which would announce to the driver, in the clipped tones of the age, that the fuel was low or the boot was open. It was, once again, years ahead of anyone else, and it was, once again, even less reliable than what it replaced. The tubes ran so hot they could warm the cabin, and by 1987 they too were gone, replaced for the final cars by calmer vacuum fluorescent displays. Aston Martin never stopped chasing the future. The future simply kept charging them for the privilege. That the company survived at all owed much to a man who arrived in 1980. His name was Victor Gauntlet, and he came out of the oil business, Pace Petroleum, taking joint control alongside Tim Hurley of CH Industrials, the two of them buying in at around £500,000 each. Gauntlet was a salesman of the old school, a man who understood the Gulf and drove cars into Oman and Kuwait and Qatar himself, and he made a decision that seemed small at the time and turned out to matter enormously. He kept the old two-door V8 alive when colder logic said to let it die. That car, and Gauntlet's Gulf connections, carried Aston Martin through the early 80s. Production climbed, from perhaps 30 cars in 1982 toward 200 and more a year by the decade's end. In April 1984, the 10,000th Aston Martin was built. And then, in 1987, Victor Gauntlet did the last thing a man who loves a company sometimes has to do. He sold most of it, 75%, to Ford. It was the deal that finally secured the marque's future, that gave it the deep pockets it had never had, that meant there would be no eighth brush with the receiver. It was also, in its quiet way, the end of the story that began with a locked gate and 4 men and a drawing made in a day. Aston Martin would go on, but it would go on as something owned. The Lagonda itself did not last much longer. William Townes returned to soften his own creation for a Series 4, unveiled at Geneva in 1987. The razor edges rounded off, the pop-up lights replaced by fixed ones, the sharp swage line along the flank simply deleted, as though the car were apologizing for having ever been so severe. Around 105 of those were built, and in January 1990, after roughly 645 cars across 14 years, production ended. The future had gone out of fashion. The car was old, and Ford had other plans. The folded paper spaceship was quietly folded away. Chapter 11. The Future Arrives. Too late, for a long time, the Lagonda was simply a joke. The car that smoked, the car that was pushed across the lawn, the car on the list of the 50 worst. That was the whole of its reputation, and for years it seemed there would be nothing more to say. But something has shifted. The joke has become a legend, and the legend has become a kind of love. Part of it is the passage of time, which is kind to strange and brave things. Values that once languished have climbed. A good early Series 2 might now fetch $50,000 or more, the later cars more still. A one-off Lagonda Coupe, converted, in a final irony, to sensible analogue dials, sold at Bonhams for close to £300,000. The car that nobody wanted has become the car that a certain kind of enthusiast dreams about, and part of it is people like Harjeet Khalsi, who bought one of the worst of them, a smoke-belching example imported from Kuwait, its seat jammed fully forward so that the drive itself became, in his words, basically a nightmare. And then did the thing so few had managed. He made it work. He rebuilt it until it ran flawlessly, and in doing so, he demystified the whole legend. He had gone looking, he said, for some kind of alien technology, some impossible fault at the heart of the myth. And what he found, in the end, was that the mythical Lagonda was actually just a car. Difficult, yes. Ambitious, beyond all reason, certainly. But a car, one that skilled and patient hands could bring back to life, exactly as skilled and patient hands had brought it into the world in the first place. Those hands are the thread that runs through the whole of it. Jack Hilliam's hands, beating aluminium on Tickford Street. The trimmer's hands, a week to a single interior. The one man who signed each engine on a plaque. They were always the real Aston Martin, not the electronics, not the microprocessors, not the promise of a dashboard from tomorrow. The craft was the thing that survived every receivership, every bad decision, every fire in the walnut, and it survived at Newport Pagnell longer than almost anywhere else in British industry. But not forever. New car production moved to Gaydon in 2003, and on the 19th of July 2007, the last car ever built at Newport Pagnell, a V12 Vanquish, rolled out of the works on Tickford Street, ending a tradition of making wheeled things on that ground that stretched back to the 1820s, before the railways, before the motor car, before any of it. Some 13,000 cars had been built there over the decades. The site lives on as Aston Martin Works, where the old cars come home to be restored, where the heritage is kept. But the daily business of making a new car from flat sheet and raw hide on Tickford Street is finished. And here is the last turn of the story, the one nobody at Woburn Abbey could have imagined as they pushed that dead car across the gravel. Look at the dashboard of almost any car built today. Look at the glowing screen where the dials used to be. Look at the smooth panel you touch instead of the switch you used to press. Every one of them is doing, reliably and cheaply, the exact thing the Lagonda tried to do in 1976 and could not. Aston Martin was not wrong about the future. It was only early. It saw decades before anyone else that the car of tomorrow would be controlled by a fingertip on a screen, and it bet everything it had on being the one to build it first, in an age when the silicon simply wasn't ready. The idea was right. The world was not. And a small, proud, fragile company nearly destroyed itself, proving that the future is a very expensive place to arrive too early. The Lagonda was ahead of its time. That was its glory. And that was its ruin. It stands now not as the worst car ever built, but as something stranger and more moving, the beautiful, doomed first draft of the world we all drive in today. It was pushed across a lawn in 1978 because the future had not yet been invented. We invented it in the end. The Lagonda just didn't live to see it work.